you have your Bible with you, please open it to Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Luke is the third book of the New Testament. I'll be reading from the New International Version. This passage relates what happened with Jesus in Jericho near the end of his ministry. It was just before he returned to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Please stand as you're able for the reading of today's scripture. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." May God add his blessing to this, the reading of his holy word. Amen.
This beautiful picture here is one I snapped a couple of years ago in Jerusalem, or in Jericho, while visiting the Holy Land. This time, whenever we went to Jericho, it was a bit cold and the leaves hadn't yet popped out entirely, and it wasn't quite this pretty. The flowers weren't blooming just yet. But this is the oldest sycamore tree in Jericho. And so it is one that would have been similar to the large tree that Zacchaeus would have climbed up in. Hopefully that helps with a little bit of visual for you. Today's text, how many of you know the song? How many of you can still sing the song? Not many. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. It is a great song, and I'm really shocked that someone in our popular culture has not made a popular contemporary Christian song out of this scripture, because the message is pretty pointed and simple enough that almost anyone can understand. That happens to be my random thought for the day, so there you go. Week 3 of our Lenten series we're titling How He Loves. Our first week, Susan, if you recall, shared with you about a Samaritan woman at a well, and her lifestyle was less than desirable. Her mistakes were many, and this caused her to be an outcast or shunned by the local community of ladies, as signified by her being at a well at noonday by herself. Jesus met her where she was and called out to her, and she was changed. And because she was changed, an entire community of people was changed. And then last week, we talked about another female. No, there's not a link here between sinners and females, just by the way, in case some of you all were going, maybe I'm the only one. Okay. So she was considered a sinner by the righteous people, okay? And the crowd gasped and murmured and whispered that she would be permitted to touch the feet of Jesus, let alone wash his feet with her tears and wipe them with her hair and anoint them with her perfume. Her pain was great, and just through her tears, Jesus said, "Your faith has saved you." And this astonished the people. Today, we witness yet another person, this one a man, named Zacchaeus, who led a questionable life. How do we know he led a questionable life? If you spend any time around church as a child, you learned this story, right? You heard me share about felt boards. and early stories. That was where I learned the story, a tree and a man up in a tree and that sort of thing. But before we get to the heart of today's message, let's put it in context, okay? Before you go too far with the story that you know. We need to put it in proper context so that you can understand a few of the little jabs or the subtleties that are in this passage. Dr. Luke was a doctor. He wrote the third gospel. The Gospel of Luke is actually part 1, okay? Part 2 we know as Acts, okay? Luke was the first part, Acts was the second part, and he wrote to the Gentiles, all right? These were non-Jews, those who were not of the Jewish faith, okay? Those who did not have a history with this God called Yahweh. They were not descendants of the people who Moses led, out of Egypt into the desert, who God promised this land to. And so Gentiles wouldn't understand all of the Jewish subtleties, okay? All of the subtleties of actually overtones have been kind of removed from Luke and Acts because it was meant to go to people who didn't have knowledge of who God was, all right? And their lives were not influenced by this expectant Messiah. So they weren't waiting on God to send a Savior, all right? They had no history with God. And so Luke places this story, as Ron pointed out, a few days, perhaps, before what we know as Palm Sunday, okay? A few days before the Palm Sunday encounter. So we know that this was near the end of Jesus' ministry, all right? It took place in the ancient city of Jericho on the banks of the Jordan River, all right? It's the edge of the Judean wilderness, okay? The edge of the Judean wilderness. The city is literally an oasis in the desert. Now, those of us who just got back, those of you who took the trip to the Holy Land with us, you understand the context of this now. It's hard to picture, isn't it? But you understand the context of this now. Because the wilderness, the Judean wilderness, was not forest and trees and lakes and paths and all of that. The Judean wilderness, okay, is deep valleys and ravines and hills and rocky countryside and cliffs. It was subject to flooding, and it was also subject to drought. All right? It's littered with thieves and robbers. So whenever you would travel through there, you had to travel in groups because the thieves and robbers would take your money, like the story in the Good Samaritan. Remember that one? Jericho is near the location where I believe that Jesus was baptized. Why do I believe this was near where Jesus was baptized? First and foremost, this is the city, okay, across from which the Israelites waited to enter the Promised Land. Remember that story? Where Joshua said, consecrate yourselves. We're going to go over into the Promised Land, where God stopped and split the waters of the Jordan River, and they crossed over on dry land to claim the Promised Land. Okay? So this is where the Ark of the Covenant, or God himself, would have entered the Promised Land we know as the nation of Israel. Okay? This is also the location across from Jericho, where the city, remember, they walked around 7 times and the walls fell down and they took the city, the Israelites did. This is also a city that sits beneath what we believe is the Mount of Temptation. So remember, Jesus was baptized. He went directly out into the wilderness before he started his ministry and spent 40 days in the Judean wilderness. And on the Mount of Temptation, that's where he met Satan and was tempted by the devil. Jericho, okay, was a preferred route. So whenever you're traveling from the region of the Galilee, which is up in the northern part of Israel, to the holy city Jerusalem, which is here, you kind of go down through the Jordan River around Samaria. Okay, you didn't travel through Samaria because the Samaritans were not good people and you really didn't want to interact with them. So you traveled around there and you came to Jericho. And then you went up over the hill, which was the town of Bethany and Bethphage, and you approached the Mount of Olives, which overlooked the holy city. And then you descended down the Mount of Olives, and you come back up and you enter the city through the eastern gate. All right? This was a path that Jesus knew well. Any Jew from the region of the Galilee who would travel to Jerusalem at least once a year for a yearly sacrifice on behalf of their family and to worship at the temple would have taken this route. So Jesus, since he was a boy, since he got back from Egypt, his family would have traveled from Nazareth down through Jericho, up through Bethany and Bethphage, down the Mount of Olives, and into Jerusalem. He knew this path well, okay? And this route was one that he probably had friends along this route. We know he had friends in Bethany and Bethphage, okay? So, his reputation, remember, is preceding him. So we talked about last week. Everywhere he goes, there's a crowd of people that are following along, right? They're waiting. They're bringing their sick out to be near Jesus so that he can heal them. They're waiting to catch a glimpse of this man and his disciples. Kids are running along and playing, and they want to have interaction with this man. Remember, he's fed thousands, at least on 2 occasions that we know of, as they came out to hear him preach and teach. He's already healed the blind, made the lame walk, called Lazarus to rise from the dead. So his reputation precedes him. He's a celebrity, all right? Now Luke indicates at the beginning of the passage what I've missed over and over again. He points out Jesus has no intention of staying in Jericho, right? He's passing through. His plan was to pass through and go on to his friend's house in Bethany, I would imagine. So he's passing through. And Zacchaeus quickly just points out he was a chief tax collector and a wealthy man. All right? There's the news for the Gentiles, all right? Gentiles got it that even this man was not a welcome individual in the homes of his neighbors and friends, okay? This man was his own breed of sinner. If you recall in the Gospels, every time they mention tax collectors and sinners, okay? So common prostitutes and thieves and robbers and adulterers, they didn't want to be lumped in the same category as tax collectors. Why? Well, tax collectors were traitors. Zacchaeus was a Jew, okay? And he had the backing of the Roman government behind him to collect taxes from his own people, okay? And so he overtaxed the people. So all of his wealth as a wealthy man was really ill-gotten gains. If ever there was ill-gotten gains, these were them, okay? So tax collectors were despised by everyone. And the only people who had association with tax collectors were other tax collectors. Okay, two modern day comparisons, scenarios that I can give you to get the grip of who a tax collector was, all right? Anybody ever get a letter from the IRS? Did you breathe deeply before you opened it? Were you anxious to open it? Did you leave it sitting on the counter for a day or two before you opened it? Anybody like paying your taxes? Anybody look forward to January, February, March, April so that you can pay taxes? You ever had a conversation in an airport or on an airplane or on vacation with somebody, a stranger you don't know very well? So this has happened to me. And you're having a conversation, the conversation is going nicely, and it always turns to what? What do you do? I work for the government. Oh, you work for the government. Yeah, what do you do for the government? I work for the Internal Revenue Service. Nothing stops a conversation any quicker than that. Unless, of course, then the next thing out of your mouth is, well, I'm a pastor. That'll stop a conversation too. Zacchaeus worked for the IRS, okay? Second comparison that I can give to you. Ever watch any movies or documentaries on the mafia or the mob? You know, the people who, in our minds, provide protection for shop owners and restaurateurs in a neighborhood. They extort money, right? Line their pockets on the hard work of other people. They operate through fear. You're afraid not to give them your money for fear what will happen. This was Zacchaeus. The people were afraid not to pay their taxes and pay above their taxes to Zacchaeus because he had the backing of the Roman government behind him. And he was not only a tax collector, Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. So he was in charge of collecting all the taxes, perhaps for that entire region, which is situated in the modern-day West Bank area of the Middle East. So he couldn't see Jesus, and he was short. He climbs up in a sycamore tree to see this Jesus who represented the polar opposite of everything that Zacchaeus was. Okay, the polar opposite. This man whom everyone adored. Jesus is this man whom everyone looked forward to his arrival. They would carry their sick out to meet him so that he would heal them. Everyone wanted to welcome Jesus and his disciples into their home, where he could be the guest of honor, seated in the place of honor, given preferred status in their home. He would bring blessing on their homes. A holy man welcomed at the table of sinners. The man who they gladly showered with their praises and gifts. No one ever gave Zacchaeus anything. Nor did anyone ever extend an invitation to Zacchaeus to come to their house. He was an outcast. He lived life outside of the good graces of all of the people in his community. And out of the corner of his eye, Jesus sees the glimpse of a shadow of a grown man in a tree. Not a kid, a grown man in a tree. And then he looks closer, and this man has on expensive clothing. Not what peasants would wear of rags. Not a common person. He has on expensive clothing, and I would imagine he's ordained with jewelry and necklaces and rings and that type stuff, showing his wealth. I mean, if you got it, flaunt it, right? And Zacchaeus is up there, and Jesus looks a little bit closer. It says Zacchaeus didn't know Jesus, but I'm guessing Jesus knew exactly who Zacchaeus was. Because Zacchaeus' reputation also preceded him. Know anybody in our town whose reputation precedes them, but not in a good way? That was Zacchaeus. Jesus had heard stories from his friends in Jericho about this crooked tax collector. Zacchaeus was one that no one would ever welcome at their table. He could never live long enough to outlive his past or outdo his sins or undo them. He had the backing of the Roman government. He was despised. That's why this seemingly insignificant encounter, just 8 or 10 verses in Scripture that happen to tell this story. That's why this is such a big deal. Even the Gentiles knew about tax collectors. Even pagans knew about tax collectors. This was an outcast like no other. This was an outcast that, again, the harlots, the thieves, the robbers, the adulterers, this is the outcast they despised. They didn't want to be associated with. So when Jesus stopped dead in his tracks, locks eyes with Zacchaeus, looking over the entourage of onlookers, all right, looking past the crowd that was gathered in front of Zacchaeus, and looks up in the tree and calls him by name. The only sound that could be heard at this point was the gasp, the silence. And Jesus goes beyond an invitation to talk with the man. Goes beyond an invitation for this man to join him. Out loud for everyone, he says, Zacchaeus, come home. Come down. I'm going to your house today. I'm going home with you. I will be a guest at your table. I am going to bring holiness and sacredness to your sinful table. I want to bless you, and I want to bless your house. That's why this was a big deal. You didn't do that. Righteous teachers didn't associate with sinners or tax collectors. And then Jesus demands nothing of Zacchaeus. Nothing. He doesn't say, come down and repent of your sins and get right with God and give to the church and do all this other stuff. He just says, I'm going to your house, buddy. Who is this man that eats with tax collectors and sinners? This incident, this insignificant moment, Zacchaeus understood the implications of this and the magnitude of the moment. Because for the first time, perhaps ever, Zacchaeus was receiving unconditional love from another human being. Despite who he was, and what he had done. This overwhelming expression of love was freely given and demanded nothing in return. This is how Jesus loves. Oh, how he loves. Love that's so compelling that instantly we're told that Zacchaeus' life is changed. Not that he prays a sinner's prayer or gets right with God or all of a sudden his sins are forgiven and he goes and reads his scrolls day in and day out. His life is changed to the point that action is immediate. Transformation immediately happens. And he realizes, I can't keep all of this money that I've stolen from these people. That's not who I am anymore. Instantly, he says, I'm going to give half of all of my wealth to the poor, and I'll pay back 4 times whatever I've taken from people illegally. See, Jesus said, salvation has come to your house today because transformation has happened. And he lifts Zacchaeus up as a model for salvation. A tax collector. The lowest of the low of sinners is lifted up as a model of holiness and salvation. There was no repentant sinner's prayer or hellfire and brimstone sermon, a miracle of the blind receiving sight, lame walking. There was none of this. There was only an offering of love and acceptance. And then an expression of transformation. It was a miracle of a dead heart having love breathed into it. And it's just that easy. That's why this story is so significant. Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today. I want to dwell in your heart. I want to bless you. Because Jesus loved him not because of who Zacchaeus was or what he had done. Jesus loved him because that's who Jesus was, and that's who Jesus is. The invitation to us today is pretty simple. Have you ever heard Jesus call your name? I don't care where you've been or what you've done, what your life looked like before. There's an invitation for transformation. I want to fill your heart with my love to the point that it will change you. And that's what Holy Communion's all about today. Where Jesus was holy at a sinner's table, we are sinners that get invited to a holy table. Where we can be filled up with the transformational love of Jesus Christ. And then as we leave the table, an overflowing love proceeds through us to everyone else. You think Zacchaeus, you think he stopped with giving back money? I think that was just the start of expressing the love